There are some things a mother knows before she leaves. She doesn't tell you everything. She can't. But sometimes, if you're lucky, she leaves the answer somewhere you'll only find it when you're finally ready to look. My mother hid mine in a coat pocket. I didn't find it until 16 years after she was gone. And by the time I did, a stranger was already selling her home. Before this story goes any further, take 1 second to subscribe and hit that like button. Because what happened in that farmhouse, and what happened in that courtroom, is the kind of story that reminds you why some things are worth fighting for, even when everyone tells you to let go. My name is Monica. And the year I turned 16, I lost my mother twice. The first time was in a hospital room that smelled like disinfectant and dying flowers. She had asked to come home at the end, home to the old farmhouse where her own mother had died, in the same front bedroom, in the same iron bed. So that's where she went. And that's where I held her hand while my father stood by the window and stared at the empty fields like a man already counting the days until something else. We buried her in the family plot on a cold spring afternoon. People came with casseroles and long hugs and the kind of words that don't mean anything but are meant to sound like everything. She's at peace now, they said. I was 16. I believed them. I should have started counting. Because exactly 14 days after we put my mother in the ground, my father's truck pulled into the gravel driveway. And a woman stepped out of the passenger side. Her name was Sharon. She wore a yellow blouse. She carried a small suitcase. And she carried it the way someone carries a bag into a house they've already decided is theirs. I stood on the porch in my mother's old cardigan and I could not make a single word come out of my mouth. My father didn't look ashamed. He looked relieved. The way a man looks when he's finally put down something heavy. That night, at supper, with my mother's chair still sitting at the head of the table, he set down his fork, looked across the room at me, and said the sentence I would hear in my sleep for the next 16 years. It's time we all moved on. I was 16 years old. And I didn't yet understand that some sentences are actually doors. And the people who say them are quietly deciding who gets to stay inside. Sharon didn't arrive with anger. She arrived with something quieter and far more dangerous. She had a method. Within the first month, my mother's quilts disappeared into boxes in the attic. Beige curtains replaced the ones my mother had chosen. The good china, the set that had passed through 4 generations of women in my mother's family, was tucked into a cabinet no one opened. The living room couch was turned to face the television instead of the window where my mother used to sit every morning with her coffee and watch the light come up over the back fields. When I moved a photograph back to its old spot on the shelf, it was gone by the next morning. Sharon never yelled. She never slammed doors. She would smile at me across a room full of relatives and say something gentle that only I could feel land like a slap. One Sunday morning, I came downstairs to find her at my mother's kitchen table, flipping slowly through a drawer full of recipe cards. My mother's handwriting. My mother's cursive on every single one. I asked her, as evenly as I could manage, to please leave those alone. She set the cards down. She folded her hands. She smiled. "Honey," she said softly, "you're a guest in this house now." I was standing in the kitchen where my grandmother had taught me to roll biscuits. I was 16 years old. And the word guest hit me somewhere deep and wordless, somewhere I didn't have the language for yet. I didn't argue. I went upstairs and sat on my bed very, very still. And I understood for the first time that grief was not the worst thing that could happen inside a house. Being erased from it, slowly, politely, with a smile, was worse. I left the day after I turned 18. Not in a dramatic storm of anger. More like a tenant whose lease had quietly expired. I enrolled at a community college 2 counties away, then worked my way into a paralegal training program. I chose the law because the law was the one place I had found where words meant exactly what they said and couldn't be smiled away. I learned to read a deed. I learned what a fiduciary owes the person who trusts them. I learned that a record, properly made and properly kept, outlives the person who tried to bend it. I told myself the farm could wait. I told myself I'd deal with it someday. When my father was older. When things were calmer. When I was stronger. That is the lie that over-responsible people tell themselves. We are so busy holding everything together that we forget to hold on to the one thing that was ours. 16 years passed. Then my father died on a Tuesday. I found out from a voicemail. Sharon had already chosen the funeral home, the casket, the hymns, the burial plot, and she buried him in the town cemetery in Brant. Not beside my mother. Not in the Hale family plot where he had lived for 30 years. I stood in the back of that church in a black dress I had bought that same morning. A cousin I barely recognized leaned over and asked if I was family, or just someone from work. At the reception, Sharon held court near the coffee urn, accepting condolences. When I came to say goodbye, she took both my hands in hers and squeezed them. "He's at peace now," she told me. The exact same words. 16 years. And the sentence hadn't changed, only the woman saying it. It's time we all moved on. I drove the 40 minutes home in the dark and cried the kind of tears that are mostly made of anger. I was grieving two parents at once. The mother I had lost at 16. And the father I had lost, in truth, the day a stranger stepped out of his truck. A month after the funeral, Sharon called to say I could come collect a few of my father's belongings. She had placed a single cardboard box on the porch like a delivery. She stayed inside, watching through the beige curtains. Inside the box, 3 flannel shirts, a coffee mug, his reading glasses, and an old canvas barn coat that smelled of diesel and dry hay. That night, in my apartment, I went through the coat pockets out of habit more than hope. In the inner breast pocket, behind a torn seam, my fingers found an envelope. It was soft with age. My name was written on the front in my mother's handwriting. The same slanted cursive from the recipe cards. Monica. Just that. Just my name. I sat down on the floor with my back against my chair and held that envelope for a very long time before I opened it. It was dated 3 days before she died. She wrote that she was sorry to leave me so young. She wrote about watching me learn to roll biscuits at the kitchen table. She wrote that she hoped I would always know where I came from. And then one line. One single line that I read again and again until the words blurred. "The land knows you, Monica. You came up out of this ground the same as your grandmother did. Whatever happens, don't let anyone tell you that you are a guest on it." She had known. My mother had known, 3 days before she died, exactly what was coming. And she had pointed me 16 years into the future, toward the one question I had never thought to ask. The question might have stayed buried forever if Cody hadn't gotten greedy in public. 3 days after I found the letter, the Hale farm appeared online. A real estate listing. Active. Staged photographs. A drone shot of the back 40 acres at golden hour, labeled endless potential. My mother's front bedroom, where she had died, captioned spacious primary suite. Sharon's son Cody had shared it on his own page with a row of money emojis and the caption, "Time to let the old place go." I sat at my kitchen table and stared at the listing price. And something shifted inside me. Not grief. Not anger. Something colder and sharper than both, the same quiet focus I used at work when a file didn't add up. Sharon was selling my mother's family farm. Loudly. Proudly. Before my father had been in the ground a full season. And the paralegal part of my brain asked one quiet question that I had spent 16 years too heartbroken to ask. Could she even do that? Whose name was actually on that deed? Monday morning, before my shift, I opened my laptop and pulled up the Morrow County Recorder's online index. I typed in the parcel number printed right there on the listing for anyone careful enough to read it. The screen loaded a list of documents going back decades. Deeds. Paid-off mortgages. A survey from the 70s. My grandmother's name. My mother's name. And then, near the very bottom, a recent entry that did not sit right. A quitclaim deed. Recorded only 8 months ago. While my father was still alive. I stared at the date. The cold focus sharpened into something with edges. I drove to the county seat in Brant and walked into the recorder's office and asked the clerk for certified copies of the full chain of title. Because if there was one thing 16 years had taught me, it was this. A house can be taken from you with a smile. But it can only be kept with a piece of paper. And I was finally, after all this time, going to read the paper. The clerk in Brant was a kind woman with reading glasses on a chain, and she did not rush me. I spread the certified copies across the long oak table and read them in order. The way you diffuse something. The story the paper told was not the story I had been living. The Hale farm had come down through my mother's family for 3 generations. And when it was deeded to my mother, Carol Hale, it was deeded to her alone. Her name. Separate property. The kind that belongs to one person and one person only. My father had lived there for 30 years. He had walked those fields in boots that knew every furrow. But the law does not care whose boots are in the field. It cares whose name is on the deed. And when my mother died 16 years ago, there was no transfer. No will on record. No conveyance. Nothing. Just her name sitting in that index like a held breath, followed by 16 years of silence where nothing honest had ever happened. That night, I didn't sleep. I pulled up the state probate statutes and read them as if for the first time, because this time, they were about me. When a married woman dies intestate, without a will, owning separate property, the law does not simply hand it all to the husband. It splits it. Where there is a surviving spouse and one child, each takes an undivided 1/2 interest. I read it 3 times. 16 years ago, the spring I turned 16, the day they lowered my mother into the ground, the law had quietly given me half of the Hale farm. Half of my mother's land had been mine since I was a child. Nobody had told me. Nobody had probated her estate. Nobody had signed a single honest piece of paper. They had just smiled and called me a guest. But the fence post was still there. And then I pulled the deed, the quitclaim recorded 8 months ago, and read every single line. The grantor was my father, Raymond Mayers. The grantee was Sharon Vance. The deed transferred all 42 acres and the house to Sharon alone. For the stated sum of $1. But it was not signed by my father's hand. It was signed, Raymond Mayers, by Sharon Vance, his attorney in fact. Sharon had not asked my father to give her the farm. Sharon had given herself the farm, using a power of attorney, signing his name with her own hand. I checked the dates. 8 months ago. My father had already been in hospice by then. I did the arithmetic in the quiet of that records room and the floor seemed to tilt beneath me. This was not a man deeding his home to the woman he loved. This was a woman gripping a pen while the man in her care no longer knew what year it was, and writing his name on a document that gave her everything. And she had recorded it publicly, right there in the county index, where it had been sitting for 8 months, waiting for someone in that family to care enough to look it up. I sat very still and held the certified copy in both hands. It was the most damning piece of paper I had ever read. And it was already mine. I went home and built a timeline the way my boss Karen Whitfield had taught me. Dates down the left side of a legal pad, documents matched to each one. The dementia diagnosis. The power of attorney signed 2 months later. The hospice admission. The self-dealing deed, recorded 6 weeks after my father entered hospice, when the intake notes described him as alert to self only, disoriented to time and place, unable to manage personal affairs. Every date pointed the same direction. And not one of them depended on my word against hers. They were all written down. By other people. In records that existed whether or not anyone believed me. Monday morning, I walked into Karen Whitfield's office and laid everything on her desk. Karen read for 10 minutes without a word, which from Karen is a standing ovation. When she took her glasses off, she looked at me with the flat, certain voice of someone who has seen it all. "Monica," she said, "this is the cleanest set-aside I've seen in a decade." She explained it simply. The deed Sharon had signed to herself was self-dealing, a fiduciary transferring the principal's property to her own name. Presumptively void the moment a court looks at it. Good faith is not a defense. It is not even an element. My half-interest had never been extinguished. You cannot adversely possess land from a co-owner without a formal legal ouster, and no one had ever ousted me. In writing. In any document. Anywhere. Sharon could not convey what was never legally hers. And I, as both a co-owner and an heir of my father's estate, had full standing to bring all of it before a judge. Karen folded her hands and asked me one question. Do you want to be reasonable, or do you want to be right? The word reasonable was right there on my tongue, worn smooth from 16 years of use. I thought about Uncle Dale with his cap in his hands. I thought about the church basement and the cousin who asked if I was family. I thought about how many losses I had quietly absorbed so no one else would have to feel them. Then I thought about one line in slanted cursive. Don't let anyone tell you that you are a guest on it. I told Karen to file. She prepared a petition to set aside the self-dealing deed, quiet title confirming my half-interest, and bring the entire property back into my father's estate for an honest accounting. And then she did the one thing that stopped Sunday from ever happening. She recorded a lease pendens against the property, a public notice that the title to the Hale farm was the subject of active litigation. No title company on earth closes a sale over a lease pendens. The rushed closing, the pen at the kitchen table, the Sunday family meeting Sharon had invited me to. All of it died the moment that notice hit the index. Cody left a voicemail at 6 in the morning. 40 seconds of words I won't repeat. Sharon called next. The warmth, finally, was gone. Scraped all the way down to the metal underneath. She called me vindictive. She said my father would be ashamed of me. She said she had sat up nights with that man while I was off building my little life 40 minutes away. Some of that was even true. And she aimed it carefully, knowing where it would land. I let her finish. Then I said the only thing I had to say. Sharon, I'm not stopping you from grieving my father. I'm stopping you from selling my mother. And I hung up. The courtroom in Brant was small and paneled in dark wood, with 5 rows of benches that creaked like a church. They were full. Word travels fast in a county that size. Cousins. Neighbors. The pastor near the back. Uncle Dale in the middle, turning his cap in his hands. And Aunt Ruth, my mother's older sister, the woman Sharon had quietly eased out of the family years ago with warmth and increasing distance, walked the full length of that aisle with her chin up, sat herself directly behind me, reached forward, and pressed her hand flat against my back. Once. Then let go. On the other side of the aisle, Sharon sat in navy, her funeral color, leaning toward her lawyer, exuding the total confidence of a woman who had always, eventually, gotten her way by being the most certain person in the room. She did not understand yet that a courtroom is the one room in this country built specifically so that feelings cannot outvote facts. Karen stood up and did not raise her voice once. She built the case the same way I had built it on my legal pad, one dated document at a time, and the quiet of it was its own kind of thunder. She walked the court through 3 generations of Hale women, ending with the deed recorded the year I was born. The farm was Carol Hale's separate property, Your Honor. Solely hers. She presented the intestacy statute, the absence of any will or transfer. When Carol died 16 years ago, her daughter Monica inherited an undivided 1/2 interest by operation of law. That interest has never been conveyed, never been partitioned, never been extinguished. Then she laid down the power of attorney, and the deed, and her voice did not change at all, which made it worse for the other side. 8 months ago, the respondent, acting as attorney in fact, signed the principal's property over to herself. To herself, Your Honor. For $1. She let that sit in the silence of the courtroom. An attorney in fact is a fiduciary. A transfer of the principal's property to the fiduciary's own name is self-dealing. And self-dealing is voidable. Good faith is not a defense. Then she read 3 words aloud from the hospice intake notes. Disoriented to time. Across the room, I watched those words land, not on Sharon, who kept her certain face fixed forward, but on the people behind her. On the cousins. On Dale. On Cody, whose crossed arms loosened at the elbows, just slightly. The first crack. They were doing the same arithmetic I had done in the records room. A man who did not know the year. A woman holding his pen. His name signed to a deed that gave her everything. 6 weeks into hospice. Sharon's lawyer stood and argued what Sharon had always argued, that she had cared for Raymond devotedly, that the farm was rightfully hers after all those years, that I had abandoned the family and come back only for money. It was a story that had worked everywhere he told it. Except here. The judge listened. Then she asked one question. Counsel, can you point me to anything in that power of attorney that authorizes a gift to the agent herself? The lawyer shuffled his papers. There was nothing. And that silence, that single, complete silence, was what broke Sharon. Because Sharon had never, in her entire life, been able to sit quietly while a room turned against her. She came up out of her chair. That is my house. Her voice cracked across the courtroom and the benches groaned as people leaned back. I earned that house. I sat up nights with that man while she flung her arm in my direction, was off in her apartment. Too good for us. She was never family. She was always just a guest in that house. A guest. And now she wants to rob a widow. The word hung in the air. Guest. The same word she had said to a 16-year-old girl standing in her grandmother's kitchen. And it did exactly what I had spent 16 years afraid it would do. It told the whole room exactly who Sharon was. The judge let the silence stretch until it was almost unbearable. Then she looked at me. I stood. I did not raise my voice. I was never a guest in that house, I said. It was my mother's. The deed always knew that, even when you didn't. Then I sat back down. And Sharon stood there, arm half raised, with nothing warm left to say. For the first time in 16 years, she had run completely out of warmth. The judge did not need a recess. She had read the file. Now she had seen the woman. And the law made the rest easy. She spoke plainly for the record in the flat, clear voice of someone who has done this 1,000 times and still believes it matters. The power of attorney gave the agent no authority to make a gift of the principal's property to herself. The deed Sharon had signed over to her own name was self-dealing. The principal's documented incapacity at the time of signing only deepened the presumption. The deed was set aside. And as for the title, the court found that Monica Mayers had held an undivided one-half interest in the Hale farm since the death of her mother, Carol Hale, 16 years prior. My half was mine. It had always been mine. A judge had simply said it out loud, in a paneled room in front of everyone who had spent 16 years pretending otherwise. I did not cheer. I did not cry. Not there. I just breathed. All the way down. For what felt like the first time since I was 16. Behind me, Aunt Ruth made a small sound, half laugh, half sob, and pressed her palm flat against my back one more time. It did not end with anyone in handcuffs. Real justice is usually quieter than people hope. The deed was void. The farm came back into the estate. My half was confirmed. Sharon received her lawful spousal share of my father's portion of the estate, the elective share the law gives any surviving widow, and she was not left homeless. She ended up with what was actually hers, which was the only thing she had never been able to bear. On the first warm Saturday after it was settled, I drove the 40 minutes from Cedar Falls to the Hale farm. No red sign in the flower bed this time. I walked the back 40 acres alone in the long gold light my mother used to watch from her kitchen window. The porch where 2 Hale girls sat for a photograph. The kitchen where my grandmother taught me biscuits. The soil that 4 generations of women came up out of. A few weeks later, Aunt Ruth came out, and we sat on that porch with iced tea, and she told me stories about my mother I had never heard. The way Carol laughed. The way she could sulk. The whole real person I had lost too young to fully know. I am going to keep the farm. I don't yet know whether I'll live there, lease the fields, or simply let it sit and breathe through the seasons. I am in no hurry to decide. For 16 years, I let other people call me a guest on my own mother's land. My mother couldn't leave me a perfect will or a tidy explanation. But she left me her name on a piece of ground, and one line written in her own hand. And I finally understand exactly what she meant. The quietest record outlasts the loudest lie. And no one can make you a guest in a place the truth says is yours. That's my story. 2 weeks after a funeral. 1 stranger at the door. And 16 years, until the records finally spoke. If this reminded you to find out whose name is on the deed, or to ask the quiet questions in your own family before it's too late, take that as your sign. Do it this week. And before you go, where are you watching this story from? Drop it in the comments below, because it genuinely amazes me how far these stories travel around the world. I'll be reading every single one.